The story we were sold is simple. A boy escapes a distant country, teaches himself the language of machines, and grows into a man who bends the future to his will. Rockets rising, cars driving themselves, humanity inching toward the stars under the guidance of Elon Musk. It feels like a modern fairy tale. But fairy tales are designed to hide something. Because the same empire that promised him control over the future quietly strip him of control over the present. This is not a story about innovation. It is a story about compulsion. Not about freedom, but about a system that expands until it consumes the one who built it. Because what happens when your entire identity becomes a machine that cannot stop running? What happens when the future you're trying to save becomes the place you hide from yourself? And more disturbingly, what if the man who is trying to take humanity to Mars is still trying to escape something much closer to home? Before there was a man trying to engineer the future, there was a system that engineered him. Not a company, not an empire, a family. Because power does not begin with wealth. It begins with emotional architecture, the invisible rules that teach a child what love costs, what silence protects, and what survival demands. And in the early life of Elon Musk, that architecture was not built on warmth. It was built on tension. He was born into a household that, on the surface, resembled privilege, intelligence, resources, proximity to influence. His father, Elon Musk, was an engineer, precise, analytical, structurally minded. A man who understood how systems worked, but not necessarily how people did. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because a child raised by someone who values structure over softness does not learn how to feel safely. He learns how to function. The home was not chaotic in the way outsiders recognize. There were no obvious signs of disorder that could be easily named or photographed. But beneath that controlled exterior lived something colder, unpredictability wrapped in authority. A system where emotional safety was conditional. Where approval was not given, it was earned. And often, withdrawn without warning. This is the kind of environment that does not break a child loudly. It reshapes them quietly. In such a system, love becomes a performance metric. You are not valued for who you are, but for how well you meet expectations that are never clearly explained. And when expectations shift, as they often do in emotionally volatile hierarchies, the child is left chasing something that cannot be stabilized. This creates a specific psychological adaptation. Hypervigilance, the constant scanning of the environment, the need to anticipate, the inability to relax, even in stillness. Because stillness, in that world, is not peace. It is danger waiting to reveal itself. There is a subtle cruelty in growing up around intelligence without emotional empathy, because it creates a paradox. You are taught how to solve problems, but not how to process pain. So when something hurts, you don't express it. You analyze it. You compartmentalize it. You try to outthink it. And over time, you begin to believe that if you can just build something big enough, complex enough, future-defining enough, you will finally outrun it. But systems like this do something even more insidious. They do not just teach a child how to survive. They teach the child that survival requires control. Control of environment. Control of outcomes. Control of uncertainty. Because unpredictability, in early life, was never neutral. It was threatening. And so the child begins to form a belief, not consciously, but structurally. If I can control everything, I can prevent the pain. This belief does not disappear with age. It evolves. It scales. Another figure in this system, his mother, May Musk, represented a different form of resilience, independence, endurance, the ability to move forward despite instability. But resilience, when modeled without emotional grounding, can sometimes send an unintended message. That survival is something you do alone. That vulnerability is a luxury. That needing comfort is inefficient. So the system presents two opposing forces. A father who embodies control without emotional safety. A mother who embodies survival without emotional dependency. and between them. A child who learns that emotional needs must either be suppressed or solved, but never simply felt. This is how psychological blueprints are formed, not through one defining moment, but through repetition, through patterns that become invisible precisely because they are constant. And in this case, the pattern was clear. Love is unstable. Safety is conditional. Control is necessary. But perhaps the most important element of this system is what was missing. Not just affection, but attunement. The ability of a parent to recognize a child's inner world and respond to it, not with correction, not with logic, but with presence. Because without attunement, a child does not learn. I am understood. They learn. I must figure myself out, alone. And when a child is left alone with their inner world, they begin to build an external one to compensate. One where rules are clear, where systems behave predictably, where outcomes can be engineered. This is not ambition. This is adaptation. Because when emotional chaos cannot be controlled, the mind searches for domains where control is possible. Technology, physics, systems, places where inputs lead to outputs, where logic replaces unpredictability, where the world finally makes sense. But here is the hidden cost. The more you rely on control to feel safe, the less safe you feel without it. And so control stops being a tool. It becomes a dependency. This is the origin of the system. Not Tesla, not SpaceX, not the public persona of a visionary, but something much quieter. A child learning that the world inside him is too unstable to trust, and the only way forward is to build a world outside him that never is. And eventually, that child grows up, not into freedom, but into scale. Because when the need for control meets intelligence, resources, and opportunity, it does not disappear. It expands. And what looks, from the outside, like innovation, is often something far more personal. A system designed not just to shape the future, but to contain the past. And the question is no longer how the empire was built, but why it had to be built in the first place. Because before Elon Musk became the man trying to control the trajectory of humanity, he was a child trying to control the only thing he never could: his own emotional reality. Before the world ever called him a genius, before investors projected their hopes onto him, before headlines turned his name into a symbol of the future, there was a boy trying to make sense of something far more immediate. Why he felt so alone, even when he wasn't. Because isolation, in his case, was not the absence of people. It was the absence of emotional resonance. As a child, Elon Musk did not simply retreat into books because he was curious. He retreated because books behaved in ways people did not. They were consistent, predictable, logical. They did not withdraw affection. They did not shift expectations without warning. They did not require him to interpret emotional ambiguity. And for a child raised in a system where emotional signals were unstable, that predictability was not just comforting. It was survival. Reading was not a hobby. It was a form of control. A way to enter worlds where the rules were clear, where problems could be solved, where outcomes could be understood. Science fiction, in particular, offered something even more powerful: a future that could be engineered. A reality where chaos could be replaced with design. But this is where the psychological fracture begins to form. Because when a child learns to regulate their emotions through abstraction, through ideas, systems, and imagined worlds, they do not learn how to regulate them in reality. They learn how to escape them. And over time, that escape becomes identity. He was not just a boy who liked books. He became the boy who lived inside them. Social environments, especially during formative years, act as mirrors. They reflect back to a child who they are, how they are seen, whether they belong. But when that mirror is distorted, through bullying, exclusion, or emotional disconnection, the reflection becomes something else entirely. A confirmation of difference. Accounts of his early life often mention isolation, difficulty integrating, being targeted rather than embraced. But the deeper impact of that is not just pain. It is interpretation. Because a child does not simply experience rejection. They internalize it. They begin to ask, often unconsciously, "What is wrong with me?" And when no clear answer is given, the mind creates one. "I am different." But difference, without acceptance, does not feel like uniqueness. It feels like defect. So the child adapts again, not by seeking connection, but by redefining value. If I cannot belong socially, I will belong intellectually. If I cannot be accepted, I will be exceptional. This is not confidence. It is compensation. And here, a critical coping mechanism emerges. Detachment. Not the calm, philosophical kind, but a functional disconnection from emotional dependency, because needing others had already proven unreliable. So the need itself begins to shrink. This is how emotional minimalism is born, not from strength, but from repeated disappointment. At the same time, something else is forming beneath the surface, a relationship with pain that is unusual. Because when pain is constant, it stops being an interruption. It becomes baseline. And when pain becomes baseline, endurance becomes identity. You do not ask how to avoid it. You ask how much of it you can withstand. This is where resilience is often misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like strength. But internally, it can be something else entirely. Desensitization. The ability to keep going, not because things are fine, but because stopping was never an option. For Elon Musk, this translated into an early tolerance for intensity. Long hours, deep focus, obsessive thinking, not as a discipline imposed later in life, but as a pattern formed early. Because when your inner world is unstable, you either collapse under it, or you build something that demands all your attention so you don't have to feel it. And he chose the latter. Computers became another extension of this control. Unlike people, they responded exactly as instructed. They did not misinterpret. They did not judge. They did not abandon. They executed. And in that execution, there was a kind of emotional clarity. Input, output, cause, effect, a system that made sense. But here is the hidden trade-off. The more you invest in systems that do not require emotional negotiation, the less practiced you become at emotional connection itself. Empathy is not automatic. It is learned, refined through interaction, miscommunication, repair. But if interaction is replaced by isolation, that learning is delayed or redirected. So what forms instead is a different kind of intelligence. High cognitive capacity, high pattern recognition, high tolerance for complexity, but paired with something quieter, emotional distance. And this distance is not intentional. It is structural, because the child who once needed connection has now learned how to function without it. But needs do not disappear. They go underground. They resurface later, not as vulnerability, but as drive. Drive to build. Drive to prove. Drive to reshape reality itself. Because if the world you were given did not feel safe, you create a new one. And this is where the psychological equation becomes dangerous. Because success, in this context, is not just achievement. It is validation. Every breakthrough, every company, every innovation becomes more than progress. It becomes evidence. Evidence that the internal narrative was correct. I am not the problem. But this validation is unstable, because it depends on external output. So the output must continue. Faster, bigger, more ambitious. Not just to move forward, but to hold the internal structure together. And this is how ambition transforms into compulsion. By the time adulthood approaches, the foundation is already set. A mind trained for systems. A body conditioned for endurance. an emotional world that has been deprioritized, and a belief, quiet but powerful, that the future is not something to wait for. It is something to control. But control, at scale, has consequences, because the more you try to engineer reality, the less room there is for unpredictability, for rest, for presence, and so the stage is set, not for success, but for something that looks like it, because the next phase of his life will not feel like a continuation. It will feel like an opportunity, a breakthrough, a moment where everything aligns. But underneath that moment is the same pattern, expanded, because what appears, from the outside, as the rise of a visionary, is, from the inside, the beginning of a trap. It never begins as a trap. It begins as alignment. For a mind trained to seek control, to impose order on chaos, adulthood does not feel like freedom. It feels like finally having the tools to execute what was always forming beneath the surface. And for Elon Musk, that execution did not arrive gradually. It arrived all at once. The early successes, Zip2, then the financial machinery that would become PayPal, are often framed as stepping stones. But psychologically, they functioned as something else. Proof. Proof that the internal model worked. That systems could be built, scaled, controlled, and more importantly, that control could be monetized. Money, in this phase, is not luxury. It is leverage, a way to expand influence over reality itself. Because when your core belief is that control equals safety, wealth becomes the ultimate safety mechanism. But here is where the structure begins to shift. Because most people use wealth to reduce uncertainty. He used it to increase exposure. Instead of consolidating, he escalated. Instead of stabilizing, he expanded into domains that were not just complex, but existential. Space, energy, transportation, not industries chosen for comfort, but for magnitude. SpaceX was not just a company. It was an attempt to control humanity's relationship with extinction. Tesla Incorporated was not just about cars. It was about restructuring the energy system of an entire planet. From the outside, this looks like vision. But from the inside, it reveals something more urgent. Because when someone takes on problems at the scale of civilization, it raises a question. What internal pressure requires solutions that large? This is the moment where opportunity becomes architecture, where ambition becomes obligation. Because success did not reduce his drive. It validated it. And validation, in this case, acted like fuel on something already burning. The system begins to close in subtly, not through restriction, but through expansion. More companies, more employees, more responsibility, more variables to control. And control, at this scale, is no longer precise. It becomes approximate, which creates a new form of tension, because the need for control remains absolute, but the ability to achieve it becomes fragmented. This is where pressure enters, not as a sudden force, but as accumulation. Every launch failure, every production delay, every public expectation, each one adds weight to a system that cannot slow down. Because slowing down threatens the identity holding it together. And so the response is not to reduce. It is to push harder, longer hours, higher intensity, more direct involvement. This is not leadership in the traditional sense. It is immersion. Because delegation requires trust, and trust requires letting go of control. But letting go of control, for someone shaped the way he was, does not feel like efficiency. It feels like exposure. So instead, he remains inside the system, deep inside it, sleeping on factory floors, micromanaging production lines, inserting himself into every critical decision. From the outside, this is often romanticized. The relentless founder, the visionary who outworks everyone. But internally, it is something else. It is the inability to step away from the machine, because the machine is now regulating something deeper than business. It is regulating identity, because if the system succeeds, he is validated. If the system fails, something far more personal is threatened. And so failure is no longer an outcome. It becomes an existential risk. This is the true nature of the trap. Not that he cannot leave, but that leaving would mean confronting what the system has been protecting him from. Stillness, silence, the absence of forward motion. Because without constant movement, there is space. And in that space, the unresolved returns. So the system must continue, not just for the world, but for him. At the same time, another layer of complexity emerges: public identity. As the companies grow, so does the narrative. He is no longer just building systems. He is becoming one. The media begins to shape him into an archetype. The real-life Tony Stark, the savior of humanity's future, the man who refuses limits. And archetypes are dangerous, because they are not designed to be lived in. They are designed to be projected onto. So now, the system is no longer just internal and operational. It becomes external and symbolic. He is not just expected to succeed. He is expected to embody something. And embodiment removes flexibility. Because once you are seen as the future, you cannot step back into the present. Every decision becomes amplified. Every failure becomes narrative. Every success becomes expectation for something even greater. And expectation, when layered over an already compulsive drive, does not motivate. It traps. Because now, the system is complete. Internal need for control. External validation of that control. Structural expansion that demands more control. A closed loop. And inside that loop, there is no natural exit, because stopping would not feel like rest. It would feel like collapse. So the man continues, building faster, pushing harder, reaching further, not realizing that the very thing that looks like freedom from the outside has already begun to function like a cage made not of limitation, but of infinite expectation. And the most dangerous cages are the ones that expand with you, because you don't notice you're trapped. You only notice that you can't stop. And by the time the world sees perfection, the cracks have already begun to form. From a distance, it looked like inevitability. Rockets landing themselves with mechanical precision. Electric cars redefining an industry once thought immovable. A man tweeting into the void and moving markets as if reality itself were responsive to his thoughts. Elon Musk was no longer just successful. He was mythologized. The illusion reached its peak not when his company stabilized, but when they appeared unstoppable. Because perfection, in public narratives, is not built on truth. It is built on selective visibility. Every launch that succeeded became proof of genius. Every failure was reframed as necessary risk. Every extreme behavior was reinterpreted as evidence of brilliance. The audience did not just observe him. They needed him to exist, because he represented something larger than himself. Hope that the future could be controlled. Hope that intelligence could outpace collapse. Hope that one individual could override systemic failure. And hope, when attached to a person, becomes pressure. The media constructed a version of him that was almost architectural. Not a human being, but a structure of meaning. The real-life Iron Man. The man who would take humanity to Mars. The one who works 100-hour weeks because the mission is too important to slow down. But here is the fracture inside the illusion. The more symbolic he became, the less human he was allowed to be. Because symbols do not rest. Symbols do not doubt. Symbols do not break down in private and ask whether any of this is sustainable. They perform continuously. And performance, when it replaces identity, creates a split between who you are and who you must appear to be. In that split, something subtle begins to erode. not competence, not intelligence, but presence, because presence requires stillness, and stillness is incompatible with performance. So the system accelerates. More announcements, more ambitious timelines, more visibility. The acquisition of Twitter Incorporated, later rebranded as X Corporation, did not just expand his influence. It extended the system into something more immediate, constant expression. Now, there was no buffer, no delay between thought and broadcast, no separation between internal impulse and external reaction. And this is where the illusion begins to crack, not in dramatic collapse, but in inconsistency. Because the same mind that could engineer complex systems was now exposed in real time to millions of interpretations. Every statement analyzed, every decision questioned, every deviation amplified. And amplification does something dangerous to perception. It distorts scale. Small missteps become defining moments. Temporary reactions become permanent narratives. And for someone already operating under extreme internal pressure, this external magnification does not clarify. It destabilizes. But the illusion must be maintained. Because by this point, it is no longer just his identity at stake. It is the belief system built around him. Investors, employees, followers, all anchored to the idea that he knows where the future is going. And if that idea fractures, the entire structure trembles. So the performance intensifies, not necessarily as deception, but as necessity. Because when your role is to embody certainty, you cannot publicly inhabit doubt. And yet, beneath that certainty, the cracks widen. Sleep deprivation becomes normalized. Stress becomes constant. Decisions become faster, not because they are clearer, but because there is no space left to process them slowly. This is the hidden paradox of the illusion. The more powerful you appear, the less room you have to be uncertain. And uncertainty, when suppressed, does not disappear. It mutates into impulsivity, into contradiction, into moments that seem out of alignment with the carefully constructed image. But even these moments are absorbed into the myth. He's unconventional. He thinks differently. He operates on another level. Language becomes insulation. It protects the illusion from being questioned too deeply. Because to question the illusion is to confront something uncomfortable. That the system may not be as controlled as it appears. And that the man at the center of it may not be as free as we assume. But illusions are not sustained by truth. They are sustained by momentum. As long as the companies grow, as long as the innovations continue, as long as the narrative moves forward, the cracks can be ignored. Until they can't. Because every system built on performance has a limit. A point where the gap between reality and image becomes too wide to reconcile. And when that happens, the illusion does not gently dissolve. It fractures. And what emerges is not a different version of the same story, but an entirely different story that was there all along. The story of what it actually costs to become the symbol of the future. At some point, the system stops feeling like expansion and starts feeling like maintenance. Not maintenance of machines, but of perception. Because once Elon Musk became the embodiment of the future, his role shifted in a way that is rarely acknowledged. He was no longer just building companies. He was stabilizing belief. Belief that the timelines were real. Belief that the missions were possible. Belief that someone, somewhere, was still in control of what comes next. And belief is fragile. It does not respond to logic alone. It requires consistency. So the burden changes. From solving problems to absorbing doubt. Every delay is no longer just operational. It becomes symbolic. Every failure is no longer contained. It spreads. And so the emotional load increases. Not because of the work itself, but because of what the work represents. This is where the hidden role emerges. He is not just a CEO. He becomes a regulator of collective anxiety. Because in a world increasingly defined by uncertainty, climate, technology, collapse narratives, his presence functions as reassurance. But reassurance has a cost. It requires projection. Confidence must be displayed, even when it is not internally stable. Certainty must be communicated, even when variables are still unresolved. And over time, the gap between internal state and external expression becomes a strain. Because holding that gap requires energy, constantly. And energy, when continuously redirected outward, leaves something else depleted. Internal processing. This is where emotional backlog begins. Unprocessed stress, unacknowledged fatigue, unresolved internal conflict. None of it disappears. It accumulates. But accumulation, in a system that does not allow pause, has no release mechanism. So it leaks. Not always in obvious ways. Not necessarily in breakdown, but in fragmentation. Moments where behavior appears inconsistent. Statements that feel reactive rather than deliberate. Shifts in tone that don't align with the constructed image. From the outside, these are interpreted as quirks. From the inside, they are signals. Signals that the system is under strain. But strain, in this context, cannot be addressed directly, because addressing it would require stepping outside the role. And the role, by now, is no longer optional. It is structural. Thousands of employees depend on it. Markets respond to it. Entire industries calibrate around it. So instead of stepping back, the system compensates. More activity, more output, more engagement. Because motion creates the illusion of stability. But motion is not the same as balance. And the faster the system moves, the harder it becomes to notice what is being lost. Presence. The ability to experience a moment without calculating its impact, without translating it into strategy, without converting it into the next step. Because when your entire environment is built on forward momentum, the present becomes irrelevant. It is either a stepping stone or an obstacle. And over time, something subtle but profound disappears. The capacity to exist without purpose. Everything must justify itself. Every moment must contribute. Every interaction must lead somewhere. This is not productivity. It is compulsion disguised as necessity. And beneath that compulsion is something quieter. Avoidance. Because stillness would mean confronting the original absence. The one that was never resolved. The need not just to succeed, but to feel. To feel without translating it into action. To experience without optimizing it. To exist without controlling it. But those are not skills that were developed. So instead, the system continues to expand outward. More companies. More influence. More reach. Even into domains of communication itself, where thought becomes immediate output. But immediacy removes reflection. And without reflection, reactions accelerate. This is where internal conflict becomes visible, because the same mind that requires control is now operating in environments that amplify unpredictability. Public platforms, global scrutiny, real-time feedback loops, and unpredictability, for someone shaped by early instability, does not feel neutral. It feels threatening. So the response intensifies. More assertion, more directness, more attempts to stabilize perception through force rather than calibration. But force, in complex systems, often creates more instability. And so the cycle tightens. Control attempts increased volatility, more control attempts. A feedback loop. And inside that loop, there is very little room for something essential. Recovery. Because recovery requires withdrawal. And withdrawal, in this structure, risks loss of control. So the system remains active. Continuously. And continuous activity, over time, does not just exhaust the body. It reshapes the mind. Decision-making becomes faster, but less buffered. Emotional responses become sharper, but less filtered. Tolerance for friction decreases, not because of weakness, but because of sustained overload. This is the reality beneath the illusion. Not a collapse, not a failure, but a condition, a state where the system is still functioning, but at a cost that is no longer negligible. And that cost is not visible in stock prices, not measurable in launches, not captured in headlines. It is internal, the gradual narrowing of experience, the replacement of presence with performance, the transformation of ambition into obligation. And the most unsettling part is that from the outside, it still looks like success, because the system has not stopped. But the question is no longer whether it works. The question is, what is it doing to the person inside it? And how long can a system expand before it begins to consume the one sustaining it? Collapse, in systems like this, is rarely a single moment. It does not arrive like an explosion. It arrives like erosion. From the outside, nothing seems to break. The companies still operate. The launches still happen. The influence still expands. But internally, something begins to destabilize. Because every system, no matter how powerful, has a threshold. Not of capacity, but of integration. How much pressure can be absorbed before it stops being processed and starts being displaced? For Elon Musk, the collapse is not defined by one failure. It is defined by accumulation finally becoming visible. The acquisition of Twitter Incorporated, transformed into X Corporation, marks a critical inflection point. Not because it was his largest deal, but because it removed the last remaining barrier between internal state and external consequence. Before, there were buffers, teams, executives, layers of interpretation. Now, there was immediacy. Thought became action. Reaction became policy. Impulse became infrastructure. And when internal pressure is high, immediacy amplifies instability. This is where fragmentation accelerates. Decisions appear erratic to observers. Messaging becomes inconsistent. The narrative begins to fracture. But what looks like unpredictability from the outside is often pressure leaking from the inside. Because when a system cannot pause, it cannot recalibrate. And without recalibration, errors compound. But here is the deeper collapse. It is not operational. It is psychological. The role he had been performing for years, visionary, controller of outcomes, architect of the future, begins to conflict with the reality he can no longer fully stabilize. And when identity is built on control, losing control does not feel like a setback. It feels like disintegration. So the response intensifies. More direct intervention, more public engagement, more attempts to assert narrative dominance. But assertion, under strain, often reveals what it tries to conceal. Because the harder you try to prove control, the more visible the lack of it becomes. This is the paradox of collapse in high-power systems. The signs are not absence. They are excess. Too many statements, too many decisions, too much visibility, an overcorrection that signals something beneath it is no longer stable. And yet, the system continues. Because it has to. There is no clean exit. No moment where everything can be paused and examined without consequence. Too many dependencies. Too much scale. Too much expectation. So instead of stopping, the system absorbs the instability. But absorption has limits. And those limits are not defined by business metrics. They are defined by the human nervous system. Fatigue deepens. Clarity narrows. Tolerance decreases. And slowly, the gap between intention and outcome widens. What was once precise becomes reactive. What was once calculated becomes immediate. Not because intelligence has diminished, but because bandwidth has. This is the hidden breaking point. Not failure of ability, but overload of capacity. And overload does not ask permission. It manifests in tone, in timing, in decisions that feel slightly off, but accumulate into something undeniable. From the outside, people begin to ask, what is happening? But the more accurate question is, what has been happening for a long time that is only now visible? Because collapse is not an event. It is a reveal of the cost that was always being paid, but never fully accounted for. And the most unsettling part is that even during collapse, the system does not stop. It adapts, which makes it harder to recognize, because adaptation can look like resilience, even when it is masking deterioration. So the man continues, still building, still speaking, still moving forward. But forward, now, is no longer expansion. It is momentum without rest. And momentum, without rest, does not sustain indefinitely. It carries you until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, what remains is not the empire, but the person who built it. And the question they can no longer avoid. If everything you created was designed to give you control, why does it feel like you have none? After collapse, real or partial, there is a moment the public rarely sees. Not the headlines, not the reactions, not the analysis, but the silence that follows intensity. For someone like Elon Musk, silence is not relief. It is exposure. Because when the system slows, even slightly, what it was holding back begins to surface. Not dramatically, but persistently. Fatigue that is no longer masked by adrenaline. Thoughts that are no longer drowned out by urgency. Questions that cannot be answered through action alone. This is the psychological aftermath. Not destruction, but confrontation. Confrontation with the gap between what was built and what it was supposed to solve. Because the empire did what it was designed to do. It expanded. It influenced. It reshaped industries. But it did not resolve the original equation. The need for control did not disappear. It intensified. The sense of isolation did not dissolve. It scaled. And the emotional distance that once protected him became the very thing that prevented integration. This is the paradox of success at this level. The external world becomes more responsive, while the internal world becomes more distant. People listen more, but understand less. Access increases, but connection does not. And so identity begins to shift. Not publicly. Public identity remains intact, still associated with innovation, disruption, the future. But internally, there is a subtle reorganization, because the role that was once adaptive starts to feel restrictive. The visionary, the builder, the one who must always move forward. Roles that once created meaning now demand maintenance. And maintenance, when applied to identity, becomes exhausting, because it requires consistency in a system that is no longer internally consistent. So the mind begins to search, not for new projects, but for new coherence. But coherence cannot be engineered the same way systems can. It requires something unfamiliar. Reflection. And reflection introduces uncertainty. Questions without immediate answers. States that cannot be optimized. Emotions that cannot be solved. This is where the original absence returns. Not as a memory, but as a condition. The absence of emotional grounding. The absence of stillness that feels safe. The absence of identity that exists independently of output. And here, a quiet realization begins to form. That everything built externally was, in part, an attempt to compensate for something internal that was never fully addressed. But recognition does not equal resolution, because resolving something requires a different set of tools than building something. It requires slowing down, letting go of control, allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately restructuring it. and for someone whose entire life has been organized around the opposite. This is not natural. It is disorienting. So the system does not disappear. It coexists. The companies continue. The influence remains. The forward motion persists. But now, there is an added layer. Awareness. Not constant. Not always conscious. But present. An awareness that the system, while powerful, is incomplete. That control, while effective, is not the same as peace. That expansion, while impressive, does not replace connection. And that the future, no matter how advanced, cannot retroactively repair the past. This awareness does not stop the machine, but it changes the experience of being inside it. Because once you see the structure, you cannot fully believe in it the same way again. And that creates tension between continuing as before and questioning whether before was ever sustainable. But questioning, at this level, is complicated, because too much depends on continuity. Too many systems rely on forward motion. Too many expectations are anchored to consistency. So the aftermath is not a clean break. It is a layered existence, functioning externally, questioning internally, and carrying a realization that does not fit neatly into either world. That the empire, for all its scale, was never just about the future. It was about survival. And survival, once it becomes identity, is very difficult to step away from, because without it, the question becomes unavoidable. Who are you? If you are no longer building something to escape, power promises expansion. But what it often delivers is amplification. The story of Elon Musk is not a contradiction of success. It is a revelation of what success does when it is built on unresolved foundations. Because wealth does not remove psychological patterns. It scales them. Control, once a survival mechanism, becomes a governing philosophy. Ambition, once a coping strategy, becomes an endless requirement. Isolation, once a condition, becomes a structure. And the world, watching from the outside, mistakes expansion for freedom. But systems do not grant freedom. They demand maintenance. And the larger the system, the more it asks of the person inside it. This is the hidden truth behind modern power, that the individuals we believe have escaped limitation are often the ones most bound by what they have created, not by force, but by necessity. Because when your identity is fused with the future, you lose the ability to exist in the present. And when every moment must serve what comes next, nothing is ever enough to simply be. This is not failure. It is cost. The cost of turning survival into ambition, and ambition into architecture, and architecture into a life that cannot pause without consequence. In the end, the question is not whether he changed the future. He did. The question is, what did it require him to give up, to do it? Because sometimes, the most powerful people in the world are not the ones who control everything, but the ones who can no longer stop controlling anything.